I've started two social media brands, one called Ladbible and one called Unilad. I was sort of dealing with so much advertising, inquiries, content moderation. I was getting very overwhelmed and I needed help to take it to the next level. I met these two men in Brighton. They came down to, or my intuition was screaming at me, telling me like, these two men are not on your side. These two men do not have your best interests at heart. And I remember sat there as I was presented this bit of paper to sign, and I was so scared of confrontation, didn't know how to say no, and I signed it. And then a week later, I had been kicked out of the business. If you fight this, it's probably going to be a lengthy process. It's going to cost a lot of money and it's probably going to go to trial. I ran out of my solicitor's office and went to buy a bottle of vodka. And I can only tell you what the nurse told me when I woke up in the hospital the following morning. Legal battle, but for me, it was a mental health battle that nearly cost me my life. If you have an ADHD diagnosis, you're 4 times more likely to take an attempt on your own life.
Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. We're going to kick it off with a big question like we always do. Who are you and what problem do you solve?
Well, my name is Alex Partridge. I suppose what gets attention is when I say that I'm started two social media brands, one called Ladbible and one called Unilad. Most recently, 2 years ago, I got an ADHD diagnosis, and it made a ton of stuff make sense in my business life and my personal life. And I reflected back on what went right, what went wrong, and I knew that I had to talk about ADHD a lot, so much. So I started a podcast, which I'm the host of a podcast called ADHD Chatter. And I just hope that somebody hears a bit of my podcast and it enables them to start their journey of self-awareness into understanding that maybe they have a brain that works a little bit differently to what they considered to be quote unquote normal earlier than I did.
And for people that are listening, or they might stumble upon one of your social media clips or something, what are some of the symptoms that they might typically be facing in their world?
Well, if you asked a doctor that question, they would tell you that ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by traits of impulsivity and forgetfulness and disorganization. And those things are definitely there. Like, they've caused issues in my life and many people in the community's life. But having reflected on my experience and my journey and spoken to really over 1,000 people now on my podcast and at events and stuff, ADHD really is so much more than that. It's a lifetime of being told that you're too much, being told that you're too sensitive, not understanding why everyone else just seems to be able to glide past and make progress, whereas you find everything so hard. It's not understanding why you have to put on this mask and change your entire personality to be more likable for whoever you're standing in front of on any given day. It's not understanding why the slightest perceived criticism or suggestion of a rejection is so physiologically painful to you that it stops you from saying no to things, turns you into a massive people pleaser, struggling with boundaries. You're convinced everyone hates you. It's all of those things. So that's why I'm so motivated to spread awareness on ADHD, because if you Googled it, and especially important for kids, because you get a medical diagnosis and obviously you're curious to know what you've been diagnosed with. And when you get the Google results, it will say struggle with all of these things. And with awareness and understanding, ADHD can also be creativity and pattern recognition, and being great in a crisis, and being able to zoom out and see the big picture and spot things that people miss, and resilience, entrepreneurialism. If you have ADHD, you're 4 times more likely to start a business. All of these things make you a tremendous asset to society. So it's why I started the podcast, to raise awareness, to help people realize as early as possible that they're not broken, they're just different, and that they've always been enough.
So when you look back now at your life, you're obviously a few years removed from your diagnosis. When you look back at your life pre that, what decisions do you think I would have probably made that differently or thought about that in a different way?
So my inability to say no and struggle to put boundaries in place and to essentially just do anything I could to avoid a confrontation put me into a serious situation in business. Like I said earlier, I started Unilad when I was at university, and I grew it on my own to millions of followers. It was going very well. I was sort of dealing with so much: advertising, inquiries, content moderation, website creation, all of these things. I was getting very overwhelmed, and I needed help to take it to the next level. So I put out this post asking for help, and I met these two men in Brighton. They came down to ask me if they could fill this gap that I needed. They could help me, and I remember that day thinking, or my intuition was screaming at me, telling me, like, these two men are not on your side. These two men do not have your best interests at heart. And I remember sat there as I was presented this bit of paper to sign, and I was so scared of confrontation, didn't know how to say no, and I signed it. And then a week later, I had been kicked out of the business. And I just remembered not knowing how to confront the situation, not knowing how to deal with the situation. And I eventually showed the bit of paper I signed to a friend, and he said, like, you need to go see a lawyer. I did, and the solicitor looked at everything and said, they're not allowed to have done what they've just done. But if you fight this, it's probably going to be a lengthy process. It's going to cost a lot of money, and it's probably going to go to trial. And you're going to have to go on the witness box and give evidence. And my mind flashed back to 6-year-old me. I had my first panic attack in the classroom when the teacher put me on the spot and said, Alex, do you know the answer to this question? And all of the kids looked at me. And under that pressure, my heart rate went, and I stood up, ran out of the classroom, and I found someone in the corridor. And I remember saying, please call an ambulance, I'm having a heart attack. And the paramedic calmed me down and reassured me that at 6 years old, I was having my first anxiety attack. So when my solicitor said, you're going to have to go on the witness box in front of all of these people, their legal team, my legal team, the judge, my family, the press were going to be there. I got in the car, I ran out of my solicitor's office and went to buy a bottle of vodka. And I can only tell you what the nurse told me when I woke up in the hospital the following morning, which was that 2 members of the public had found me in an alleyway, clutching this bottle, tried to stagger away, tripped up, hit my head on the wall. They called an ambulance. And I remember, as the nurse was telling me this feeling of shame and anxiety came over me. And in that moment, I thought the only thing I needed was more alcohol to cure this anxiety and shame. I jumped out of the hospital bed, ran out of the ward. Security had been called. It's all a bit of a blur, but before I knew it, I was in the back of a police car outside of the hospital, and my parents had been called. And I remember seeing my mum and dad just looking at me through the glass of the police car with this look of fear and desperation in their eyes. That's what took me to AA. That's when I started hearing those 4 letters, ADHD, which I didn't really take in, but that's when I first heard them. Fast forward 2 months, the trial came about in London in the High Courts, and I got through it. The judge was very accommodating. He let me take breaks. He let me walk off these anxiety attacks around the courthouse, throwing up in the toilet. And I was cross-examined for 7 days. Even the judge said it was excessive. But I got through it. Fast forward 2 months, my phone went, and it was my solicitor, and he said, Alex, are you on your own? And he said, and I said, yes. And he said, you've won everything. You've won the company back. And I remember in that moment on the phone, just falling to the floor. My knees just went, and I just started crying on the floor. It was a huge, legal battle. It was 5 years from the first solicitors meeting to that phone call. A huge legal battle, but for me, it was a mental health battle that nearly cost me my life. I had no idea that I was dealing with this thing in my head called ADHD.
How common is that scenario from the other people you spoke to around using alcohol as a coping mechanism for ADHD? It
comes up, sadly, in every episode that I record. I've done 150 episodes like I said, thousands of people at events and online and stuff. And in every episode of my podcast, it comes up. I have a shelf unit behind the mics where I ask all my guests to bring in an item that most represents ADHD for them. And without 9 times out of 10, the guest says, can my item be a bottle of wine or a bottle of beer? Because it's been such an issue for me. And I have to sort of say, oh, can you think of something else? Because we're trying to make this collage of items. But, because, our base level dopamine is lower than a neurotypical. And pair that up with really, really bad impulse control. I always reach for alcohol just to get me in a slightly elevated mood, but that triggers something in my head that renders me unable to stop. I have a form of alcoholism. I'm an alcoholic. I'm very, very happy to say that. Very easy to say that now, because if I don't say that, then it will kill me. When I have a drink, it triggers this allergy of the mind. I think Matthew Perry said it. And I can't think of anything else apart from the next drink. And if the next drink isn't readily available, then I'm not in a good mood, and I'll leave dinner and I'll try and run to the petrol station. So the only thing that I can do is to really make sure I don't have that first drink.
I feel like everybody will know Unilad and Ladbible. Like it was a huge part of our kind of youth and things like that. So how have you, when you look back on maybe like the glory days and the early days, I know that one of the words that you've kind of mentioned is like an obsession. How did you, on reflection, use it as a bit of a superpower to grow those initial businesses?
I think when you have ADHD and you find something that connects with your intrinsic motivations and passions, and we can talk about how you figure those out later on, but I think when someone with ADHD finds that, then you can become world-beating at it. World class for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, those lists of positives, the hyperfocus. When that got activated for me, that the brakes were off and there was no stopping my attention going into the businesses, which really I was fascinated by social media, not so much about the two brands in the early days. It was just, that was what was trending, what was topical. So that was what I made, but it was the fascination and the hyperfocus towards how the algorithms worked and wanting to deeply understand what they wanted and how they operated. But whatever your thing is, if you've got ADHD and you find something that aligns with your true passions, and that hyperfocus is that superpower. Because you will work harder, you will stay focused on something for longer than a neurotypical person will. And when things get tough or things get difficult, then you have that up your sleeve to activate and to turn on. And it is, without a doubt, it's the thing. My friends and family were concerned for me when I was launching Unilad. I didn't leave my room apart from to eat and use the toilet for weeks. Like, I was just locked in. And it's that obsession that you call it hyperfocus, call it obsession, paired with that ability to sort of to spot patterns and to see trends and to understand what the algorithm wants. That, without a doubt, gave me a massive competitive advantage.
And then you spoke about like the rejection sensitivity. What when you were launching those businesses, what was your relationship like with validation?
I've always unknowingly been striving towards being accepted and liked. And for me, it's only when the person or the whatever's said to me is a true reflection of an insecurity that I have. And I didn't know about RSD when I was starting my companies, but I sure remember the feeling when a brand didn't want to work with me for whatever reason, or a bit of content didn't perform as well as I had anticipated. It was that kind of instant, visceral, physiological pain. Like, it's a real pain that when you this horrible thing called rejection sensitive dysphoria is triggered. It can completely derail your day. You can be having a productive, happy day, and then someone or something happens that that reinforces that internal narrative that you're not enough, or that you're useless, or you're a useless piece of shit, and something just, and it is visceral. Like, that's the word I keep saying, visceral, because it's such an instant feeling, and it's internalized sadness for me. I remember just bursting into tears, and it's like the little boy within me, the child within me, that is trying so hard to put on this mask of being perfect and to do everything correct and not let anyone down, let someone down, because obviously that's life. That happens, you get rejected. But when that does happen for us, because we are trying so much harder to be perfect, then it hurts so much harder as well.
What was you mentioned then about in a dialogue and the story you were telling yourself, what was the story before the diagnosis compared to after?
I hated myself before the diagnosis, and I'm working on that to get better. And that's not really down to anything that I did or said to myself. It was what other people said to me. And it's amazing when I heard that kids who have neurodiverse conditions, with me it's ADHD, I suspect there's autism there as well, and I'm going on that journey at the moment. But neurodiverse kids have 20,000 more negative criticisms and comments from people around them in the first 15 years of their life than a neurotypical child. 20,000 more little comments. Like, it's terror. It's tragic. Like, stop fidgeting. You're too sensitive. You're weird. I remember my first memory, and it all came back when I was really young. Someone said to me in the playground, "You could be one of the cool kids, Alex, if you weren't so weird." But I'm not an isolated case, obviously. Kids who have ADHD have 20,000 more. So it's those comments that compound over a lifetime to create an adult that subconsciously believes that they're not enough and that they're broken. It's so sad. People go through so many years, particularly women, because it's only recently that women and girls have actually understood that they could have these things. Like, there's a tragic story there just in itself. But so many people have gone their whole life masking, not feeling enough, feeling broken, different, misunderstood, being told that you're too sensitive, different, all of these horrible things. And they've compounded to create adults that are so scared of offending anyone, so scared of putting a foot out of line, standing up for themselves. And it's a heartbreaking story. And it's what motivates me now to do the podcast, because I can't go back in time, right, and put my arms around the younger version of me in that corridor as the paramedics telling me I'm not dying. I thought I was. I remember how scared I was. I can't tell that little kid that he's not broken, he's just different, and everything's going to be okay. But obviously what I can do is I can just talk about ADHD so much that a little version of me does hear it. And it enables him to start his journey of awareness earlier than I did.
So you've put yourself in a really brave position. We've had a few guests on in the last few days who, when we've said we're having you on, they say, "Oh, will you be talking about ADHD?" They don't talk about Ladbible. It's straight away about ADHD. But I imagine that comes with some great acceptance and being a voice, but also probably the other people who might say to you, "Well, this is we're all on our phones too much now. We're all addicted to dopamine. Actually, it's overhyped. It's overblown." So what do you say to those people who think it's a myth?
Well, I mean, it's just like I would recommend watching my podcast, where I've spoken to the leading academics and scientists in this area. The thing is, and the confusion lies with everyone does have traits of ADHD. So I think it's easy to see a bit of content and say, well, I forget my car keys sometimes. Like, oh, I zone out of conversations sometimes. Like, this is ADHD is nonsense. Everyone does those things. It's just human. And everyone does do those things. Everyone does forget someone's name. But it's the extremeness of how often it happens and how much it derails someone's life, and how much effort it is for the person who would actually qualify to get an ADHD diagnosis, how much effort it is for them just to maintain this base level of normality. When a neurotypical person forgets their car keys, or the highs in their life and the lows in their life will be like a little wave, like a horizontal S, but the the actual person who's these symptoms and traits are so severe that they would qualify for a diagnosis. Like the highs is the peak of Everest, and the lows is the lowest point on Earth. Like it's the extremeness and the continuousness of it that differentiates someone who is just a bit forgetful and zones out from time to time compared to someone who would actually qualify to get an ADHD diagnosis. We know that the comorbidities, and I don't like the word comorbidities, but the coexisting conditions with someone who would reach the criteria to get a diagnosis is so heartbreaking because of the self-esteem issues and the knock-on effects of a lifetime of forgetting, being disorganized, forgetting to pay your car parking ticket. So all of these things that there is humor in the short term, but actually grow to create the proven comorbidities of anxiety and depression and low self-esteem. The saddest one is if you have an ADHD diagnosis, you're 4 times more likely to take an attempt on your own life. If you're a man, and if you're a woman with ADHD, you're 8 times more likely to attempt to commit suicide. That's the reality. So when someone says, well, everyone has ADHD, is everyone 8 times more likely to try and kill themselves because they hate themselves that much?
What have the conversations been like with the people that have gone down the assessment route to get a diagnosis, and then they maybe haven't got the diagnosis that they wanted? So maybe they've got the results and they don't have ADHD. Where have they felt, or where have they been left?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've spoken to some people who, I think when you go to get a diagnosis of ADHD, a lot of the time you're at a crisis point in your life where you desperately need answers to help you understand why you operate in the way that you do. So I think there's a real risk, and I've spoken to people that have gone for a diagnosis, have gone for an assessment, convinced that they have ADHD and that they're told they're not. There's lots of conditions that can mirror the traits and signs of ADHD. I mean, social anxiety can be a really common, and I spoke to a brilliant doctor on this who told me all about it. Like if you're socially anxious in the short term, you can present as many of the traits as ADHD. You can zone out of conversations, you can be forgetful, be quite scatty, disorganized, when really it's just because you're so anxious that your mind is really unable to focus on a conversation or think about appointments or organization because you're so anxious. So that's one. And sometimes people hear that they're just socially anxious instead. There's a huge overlap between, you can't really talk about ADHD without talking about trauma and how many events, and doesn't necessarily have to be in our early years, it can be at any stage. A trauma response very much looks like the traits of ADHD. So I think the risk and the danger that we're seeing at the moment is lots of people will see something or hear something on social media, and it will just label all of these traits as that's 100% ADHD. So somebody will relate and see themselves in that bit of content, go to a psychologist desperate, and the psychologist will says, no, you might not have ADHD, or you don't have ADHD. You actually might just be suffering from social anxiety, or this might be a trauma response. So, there's a lot to process, and then that opens up, okay, well, what do you do then? Therapy, is a great start, but that's not accessible to everyone. But yeah, it's often sometimes disappointment, because I think you can set yourself up, you can sort of self-diagnose, which I think that it is valid, but also it does put people in murky water sometimes when they can convince themselves that they have this thing called ADHD, and then a psychologist says, actually, that's not ADHD, that's and then they dive into why, and they actually realize, well, you had a really, really bad childhood, and that horrible thing happened when you were 3. Maybe that's a response to what happened there. And, it's very nuanced and very unique for everyone. But yeah, it's, I think when people do self-identify and self-diagnose with ADHD, and I think there is a place for that, because diagnosis is so long to get diagnosed. But also I think we have to be careful that people are doing it responsibly and understand that there are other conditions that mirror the traits of ADHD.
Do you find, because obviously you're in this world and you're speaking to these people, do you find that there are people that are taking them, going down that path irresponsibly? Like, I know that if you type into Google ADHD test, I'm sure that like BuzzFeed comes up as one of the top ones or something like that. So what kind of stories have you got about people that are maybe not doing things in the right way?
I personally don't have any stories. So the people who come on my podcast, they essentially have a diagnosis. So it's an interesting area that I haven't really explored properly in terms of like the people that would be going to get a diagnosis, but would not qualify for one.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Okay. So for people who are listening, who are on that journey, I have the diagnosis. What have you found around coping strategies? You know, things that you wish you knew before that tend to make life a little bit easier now.
I mean, so I don't think ADHD is a deficit of attention, even though that's what it's called, like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. I truly believe that ADHD is a deficit of self-awareness because of the reasons I've touched on in this chat, that constantly changing who you are, putting on this mask, not really being connected to your true self and all of that. And I think when you grow up, you have no idea who you really are. So you say yes to things, a new relationship, a new job, a new hobby. In the short term, it's very exciting. You're making a decision based on short-term dopamine. But if it's not a fit and it's not actually connected to your intrinsic motivations and passions, then when that period of excitement ends, we can call it a honeymoon period, you'll leave that relationship, you'll get bored of that job, that domain that you just bought for your new hobby will enter your graveyard of domains with all of the rest, and you'll feel like crap again because you're like, why have I left another relationship? Why did I not stick at that job? Why have I just designed this logo for my new company that I thought was going to be my new life's purpose, and now I'm lost interest in it? All of these things that really don't help with the self-esteem issues. So I think it's the biggest learning is that it's a deficit of self-awareness. And what can you do to help you grow your self-awareness? And what I've done, and many people on my podcast have done, is really be honest with yourself. Like, you have to be honest in these exercises, and they're really basic, but just ask yourself as often as you can, like, what did you do today that made you happy? What did you do today that upset you? What did you do today that you found easy, challenging? Like, do that very basic exercise as often as you can, and you'll build up this arsenal of self-awareness. And I've spoken to people and they've done this, and they've burst into tears because they've kind of compared the findings of their self-awareness exercises with the thought of who they thought they were. And it's a glaring contradiction a lot of the time. And once you build up this self-awareness, and another way to do it, by the way, is really analyzing your knee-jerk reactions. These are very inbuilt reactions that we all do that almost occur before our masked version of ourselves has time to react. Like, so if an opportunity comes your way, so you see a sign in the newspaper saying there's an open audition for a musical, and you get genuinely passionate, excited about that, and that's the reaction you want to listen to. But then you remember, oh no, my parents want me to be a doctor. So you forget about it, and then that's your masked reaction to ignore it. Like, pay attention to the knee-jerk reactions, because they're going to be much closer to like who you really are underneath all of these years of masking. And journal, write them down. They all add up. And so when something does come into your now, a new job, new hobby, new relationship, you can look at the points, like the components. What is it about that job, that person, that hobby? And then compare it to the findings of your self-awareness exercises, and you can start making better choices, more choices that will have a greater chance of that thing aligning with who you really are, and therefore you sticking at it. And the knock-on effects of not abandoning stuff, you build confidence. You realize that you are capable, you are amazing, and that's when the tears come, because you realize that you don't just quit everything you start. it's there's lots of stuff, but building on your self-awareness, for me and so many people I've spoken to, has been the real fork in the road moment, the really point of pivot where they really noticed a massive increase in the trajectory of their mental health.
Wow, okay. I'd imagine you've had professional and personal relationships since your diagnosis, and ADHD feels like a term that probably doesn't have enough knowledge around it to just be able to tell someone, before we get into this relationship, I have ADHD, and they know exactly what to do about it. So what about advice on how to manage a relationship with someone who perhaps doesn't have it or doesn't know much about it? What have you learned about that?
Yeah, I think, it's quite tricky, because a lot of the information about how your brain works is going to be very nuanced to you. So, and what people come up against is a lot of prejudice. It's why people are scared to disclose at work still a lot of the time, because even though they understand and they found their tribe and they found community, they know that those 4 letters have a massive stigma still attached to it. So, especially at the start of a relationship, you have to really trust your gut, I think, and really trust your intuition on whether you feel safe to open up about it. And I would suggest starting small. You don't necessarily have to dive in and say that you're ADHD or autistic or neurodiverse. You can just suggest, you can be quite lighthearted about it and say, I struggle with X, Y, and Z, or I really find that when I start a project, I really struggle to divert my attention away from it. Just see what response you get by little comments in a relationship. RSD, again, going back to rejection, is the biggest point of pain in relationships where ADHD is involved. It's so important to communicate, and this really comes later on down the line, once you've both established that neurodiversity is an open topic of conversation, that you are dealing with this thing called RSD, and it's really helpful to have a safe word, or especially when you're out in public, a tap on the shoulder or a little safe word to tell your partner that I'm triggered right now, I need 5 minutes, because a lot of the time that's all it takes. It's as long as you don't escalate it and you are aware that you're triggered, it very much, you forget about it very quickly. And so it's so important when you're in that really sort of epicenter of the trigger, if you're in a restaurant or a social setting with your partner, to really have that awareness to put that safe word or that signal in place. So you can go to the loo for 5-10 minutes and come back, or you can just tap your partner on the shoulder so they know if you go quiet for 10 minutes, there's a reason. And removing yourself from the situation, again, it's such an important bit of advice. This is really interesting to recognize that when you are triggered, like you'll see red, you'll fill up with internalized sadness or rage, and a lot of the time in that moment you can say some really nasty things, or things that aren't really proportionate to what has triggered you. And so important in that moment, rather than lashing out and saying something, like remove yourself. You can do this once you've got the awareness of RSD. Just put a breaker between the trigger and your response, because you will calm down. You will become more regulated, and then you can reapproach it from a calmer setting. And especially in relationships, because this will happen. The people I've spoken to, it's almost daily. The extremeness of it varies, but it's a terrible thing, RSD, in relationships, and it's so important to communicate what happened with your partner retrospectively. So after you have become regulated again, and after you are seeing clear again, sit down with your partner and really make time for this and say, look, this is what happened. This triggered me. I removed myself from the situation. I think communication is so key, and there's no need to have any shame as well. I think, again, the feedback I get when I spoke to a brilliant therapist called Karen Doherty, who specializes in RSD and relationship, and she was saying that the biggest killer in neurodivergent relationships is shame, because all of the advice that I've just mentioned is almost sort of counteracted by, well, I'm a 36-year-old man, I shouldn't have to remove myself from a situation because you've said a little comment, I should be able to, control my emotions. But it's not. It's so much harder than that. So there's a lot of shame involved that stops you from implementing these. It's so important to recognize and to remind yourself that it's not your fault. None of these reactions are your fault. You're responding to those 20,000 comments made when you were younger. Your nervous system has been snapped back to all of those nasty comments you had. You're not responding proportionately now. And once you recognize that, again, you can really remove a lot of the shame and communicate with your partner. It's really so important to have a healthy relationship. Neurodiverse or not, communication is fundamentally important.
Could you paint a picture and maybe give us some examples of what those triggers could actually look like in the real world?
Yeah, so it's an interesting example. One that happened personally to me recently. I really think that I'm good at a few things, and one of them is making pancakes. So it's ridiculous, but I can look back now with laughter and humor. But I was making pancakes, and I couldn't wait to make pancakes for my partner. And I went out, bought the ingredients. I was mixing everything in a bowl. My partner just flipped like off the cuff and just said, "Oh, you're mixing those ingredients in the wrong order." And that was the thing that triggered me. And my sort of happiness and euphoria for the evening ahead to show my partner pancakes, because I thought that's what I'm good at, I instantly derailed, and I went from like euphoric to almost bursting into tears in a second. Like, that's how extreme it can be, because I attach making pancakes to something that I think is part of my character and value. So when I have something internal that I'm proud of and happy, and someone criticizes that, it hurts like doubly as much. So that's one example. I think there's so many. I interviewed Ned Halliwell, probably the number one ADHD authority on the planet, Dr. Ned Halliwell from the States, amazing man, on my podcast. And he did a talk at Harvard, and he delivered an hour and a half keynote, absolutely smashed it. Everyone stood up, standing ovation. There was one lady, he said he noticed one lady sat down at the back, scowling. And it ruined his evening. He was in the taxi on the way home, and his wife said, "What's wrong? What's wrong with you? You just did an amazing talk, Edward." And Edward said, "No, it was rubbish. It was absolutely terrible. I was awful. I'm useless." And she said, "What do you mean? That everyone was standing up, clapping?" And he said, "No, there was one lady at the back who looked miserable." And his wife said, "No, well, she could have been ill. Like, she could, for whatever reason, be unable to stand up." But that's what kept him awake for the next 2 weeks. He couldn't sleep because he thought, despite all of the evidence to contradict it, the internal child within him focused on the one lady who wasn't giving him approval and praise. And in his head, he ruminated, he catastrophized, that he convinced himself that internal narrative, that internal inner critic that is so nasty to us, was validated by that one lady sat at the back of the lecture theatre. And that was a massive RSD trigger for him. It's so unpredictable. That's the scary thing about RSD. You can be having a brilliant day, and someone could just, the tiniest comment. But when you have an awareness of it and you understand that it's not your fault, you can be a lot kinder to yourself.
We a lot of people that listen to this podcast are business owners, entrepreneurs, but also a lot of salespeople. And I know that there'll be salespeople listening to this now with ADHD, maybe diagnosed or undiagnosed, and they probably are very sensitive to rejection. And if you work in sales, welcome to the world of rejection. If you are wanting to be a high performer, but you feel like you may have, or you do have ADHD, how can you really harness it as a superpower to get the most out of it?
So ADHD has enabled people to create amazing businesses. The stat is you're 4 times more likely to start a business if you have ADHD. And I think if you are listening with ADHD, you probably will recognize the traits of creativity and being calm in a crisis. That's been so powerful in my career when, that the metaphorical house is burning down and everyone's panicking. And for me, that's great. I'm like, whoa, okay, dopamine, I'm switched on. I can navigate the path to the solution here. And that's such a superpower for an entrepreneur. Or, because things go wrong, right? Crisis will happen. And to be able to switch on and navigate the path to the solution is a massive strength. The sort of pattern recognition, being able to zoom out and see the big picture and spot things that other people miss. Being like, once you find something, you're so resilient. When you find something that connects to your why, you're like the fierce resilience that's activated. And that obsession, that hyper-focus that will just enable you to keep going. And I'm against hustle culture. I don't like it, but with ADHD, it's not. It's a genuine drive to work towards something that to be a true fit for you. And when that is activated, you will become world beating at it, like world class. The intuition, which I ignored that day, when I signed that bit of paper, that's such a strength. Once you really appreciate how powerful that is, then you can make better decisions. You can see when someone's like not being truthful to you. You can spot someone who is not got your best interests. And when you learn to listen to it, which is hard to do, but when you learn to trust that gut, we are super aware of danger. Again, going back to those 20,000 comments, so when we're an adult, that heightened intuition, that hypervigilance enables us to be a great negotiator. We can see when someone's lying or not telling the truth or not putting all their cards on the table. And that enables you to have the upper hand. Spotting trends has helped me massively and being able to just assimilate. And I don't know how I do it. That's the thing. Like I can give me a big problem and I can give you the solution, but just please don't ask me to show my workings. And it's so common in the community when I hear people that are doing amazing things and they're just driven by this internalized energy that is so common in people with ADHD. And you just go from one thing to the next. And it's so important to understand that with that comes a challenge of not pausing and really reflecting on progress, because otherwise I always like to paint the picture of like an ADHD person starting a business as building this brick wall. And I think it's so easy to, when all the stars are aligned and all of those things I just mentioned are activated and you're like, right, hyper-focus, superpower mode, go, then you go all in really fast. You buy the domain, you design the logo, you build a team around you, you do all the stuff, and then suddenly you've got this big brick wall in front of you that is the business, and you're sort of just stood in the shadow of it, really overwhelmed, and you have no idea how all of the bricks work. And it's in those moments where we will quit because overstimulated, overwhelmed. So important. And with Unilad and Ladbible and now each brick in the business for me was a post. It was a bit of content. Now with the podcast, each new episode is it's a brick. It's a person to hyper focus on, to research, to write the questions for, to meet, to interview, to edit, and then the brick is done, it's packaged, it goes out, and the podcast, the business, is all of these bricks stacked upon each other to create this wall. And because I've really spent time on each brick, it doesn't overwhelm me because I understand how all of the bits, all of the components work. So whatever your business is, like it's so important to find the bricks within it, and to really take time as well to recognize when you complete one, because otherwise you can really quickly stack 20 bricks on top of each other, do all of these tasks to progress your business. And because you haven't intentionally celebrated all of the little wins, all of the little bricks being completed, suddenly, again, you've got this brick wall and you feel underqualified to manage it because you haven't in your head recognized the achievements. And, we can call it imposter syndrome, whatever you like, but it's a real tangible thing that and every person on my podcast has spoken to. It's feeling underqualified and not recognizing that you are capable of doing what you're doing and taking your business to the next level. And again, that's another big reason why people quit, because they get into this terrible situation where they've done this huge amounts of work, they've grown this business, and then a year later they're sort of looking down at all of the rungs on this ladder, being on the top rung, and they have no idea how they got there. And it's a terrifying place to be. And that's where you see a lot of people quitting as well, through fear. So I think really being intentional about all of the wins on the way up. So when you look back, you understand how you got there and that you are the right person to be there.
Wow. Do you know what I took from something you said then? If we were in tribes still, if we were in small tribes, having ADHD in a tribe would be an amazing thing, because someone would be hyper focused on perhaps all the eventualities and thinking about the things that maybe aren't as obvious and the patterns to recognize. So there's probably someone who thinks it would be a burden, but it sounds like from what you just said, it'd be the total opposite. So I think that's an amazing answer. What do you think we've not asked you that we should have?
I mean, what have you not asked me? I guess, I don't know, we covered quite a lot. I don't know, hosts have done that. Biggest themes in the podcast, but I've pretty much done that with I mean, it really is RSD, and I've spoken a lot about that. I don't know. Did you have anything else?
I think we've smashed it. I think we've covered a lot of things. The last thing I want to ask you is, where can people go to, whether it's starting off with your podcast, starting off with your content, or if they're just starting off on this journey that you've been on, where they have their doubts and they maybe think that they're thinking a bit different than their peers, where would you recommend they start that journey?
I mean, you can listen to my podcast. It's everywhere: YouTube, Spotify, anywhere where you consume podcasts. Or, but if you want to get assessed for ADHD, and you hear this, you hear other people, and you think that sounds like me, that might be something that I'm dealing with, then you really have two options at the moment, which both are quite dire, and I don't want to end on a bad tone, but the NHS in the UK, if you're listening in the UK, is really terrible at the moment. It's about 2 years if you're lucky and 7 years if you're unlucky, depending on where you live. Or you can go private, which costs about £1,000, and even that has got quite a long wait now. So if you really want to, I would suggest starting the process on one of those, whichever one. If you can afford to go private, that will be quicker. But if you can't, then it's a queue to join. There's so many things you can do in the interim to give yourself, be kinder to yourself. And we've spoken about some of them today. Just having, if you are at that stage, just reminding yourself that you are probably most likely, whether it is ADHD or something similar, you're dealing with something that's not your fault, and the consequences of those things therefore aren't your fault. Because it's the shame and the low self-esteem and the anxiety and the depression, the terrifying comorbidities that really get people down and chip away at their self-confidence. Finding community is so important, whether that's at work or with friends, family, or if you don't have access to somebody that you can speak to, community is great. Social media, for its negatives and positives, is great. For just the comment section on some of the big ADHD accounts is, you don't even have to contribute. You can just read some of them, and you're, it's hugely therapeutic to find out that you're not the only person who's dealing with this. There's a hell of a lot of people out there who are going on this journey right now. And ultimately, to end with, really, is don't try and fix yourself. There's lots of things you can do to help manage the executive function challenges of having ADHD. Like, I've got a big whiteboard in every room of my flat, right? Literally massive. And I write everything down, and I keep everything visual. And because if I don't, I'll forget about it. I have bracelets on. I put on every morning, and each one has a task on, like empty the dishwasher, reply to that email. When I complete a task, I take them off, put them in a bowl, and if I complete all of them, I reward myself. I buy myself something off Amazon. Gamification, I try and hold my breath for as long as it takes to empty the dishwasher or to hoover the flat before my favorite song finishes. Accountability, share your goals with someone, a partner, a colleague, or someone you trust. So, relying on our own accountability is hard sometimes, but if if you share your goals with someone and have regular check-ins, and it activates this amazing phenomenon called like body doubling, which really is a game changer for people with ADHD. There's so many practical tips that can help you get past some of the executive function challenges. But the biggest takeaway really is to not try and fix yourself, because so many of us have spent years and years trying to fix ourselves, trying to change who we are. And that is so exhausting, firstly. And secondly, it takes up so much time. And once you stop trying to fix yourself, you can take back so much of that time, and you can put it into understanding who you really are. You don't need to be fixed. You just need to have a better understanding of that fact that you don't need to be fixed. And if you start putting that energy away from how to hack your ADHD, how to change, how to medicate, how to become a different person, then you can actually start putting it into realizing that you are just different and not broken, and that you are enough.
Beautiful. Great
Thank
answer.
you so much.
Alex, thank you so much. That was an illuminating conversation. Very brave of you as well. And I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people. So thank you so much.
Thank you.